Chapter 1. The Contract That Binds. Rain poured down relentlessly over London, tapping a steady rhythm against the fogged-up windows of the Rose and Crown tea room. Emily Carter stood behind the counter, her hands moving mechanically as she poured steaming Earl Grey into a chipped porcelain teacup. The faint clink of the china was drowned out by the chatter of soggy customers, shaking water from their umbrellas onto the floor. But Emily barely noticed. Her mind was miles away in the Cotswolds, where the little stone cottage, the place she had called home for 25 years, was slipping from her grasp. The letter from the bank was still etched in her memory. Final notice. Repossession. Scheduled for November 15th. 10 days left. 10 days to save the only thing her father had left her before his heart gave out under the weight of failed investments and a colossal debt. She wiped her hands on her worn apron, the fabric thin from months of use, and glanced at the clock. 5:30. Her shift was nearly over, but the fear in her chest didn't fade. The wages from this job, barely enough to cover rent for her cramped East London flat, couldn't touch the £200,000 debt her father had left behind. She had sold everything she could, the old Morris Minor car, her mother's silver locket, even the antique desk where her father once sketched his dreams of wealth. But it still wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up, expecting another drenched regular, but instead a man stepped in. A man who didn't belong here. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a tailored black overcoat glistening with raindrops, the kind of coat worth more than her yearly salary. His dark hair was neatly slicked back, though a few strands fell carelessly over his forehead, and his jawline was sharp, as if carved from marble. James Harrington. She didn't need to hear his name to know who he was. His face had graced enough tabloid covers, always with a champagne glass in hand and a different woman on his arm. CEO of Harrington Enterprises, a notorious playboy, and now an enigma standing in her tea room. He scanned the room briefly, his gray eyes cold and appraising, before settling on her. Emily straightened, a flicker of unease stirring in her stomach. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the slight tremble in her hands. James didn't answer right away. He strode to the counter with the confidence of someone who owned every space he entered, his polished shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. Up close, he was even more imposing. 6 feet of solid muscle and an aura of authority that made the small room feel smaller. "Emily Carter?" he said, his tone clipped, as if testing her name. She nodded, wiping her hands again, though they were already dry. "That's me. Do I know you?" "No," he replied, slowly removing a leather glove with deliberate care. "But I know you. More precisely, I know your situation." He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim folder, dropping it onto the counter with a soft thud. "Your father's debts, the house in the Cotswolds. The bank's about to take it all, isn't it?" Her breath caught, a wave of shame heating her cheeks. "How do you—" "I make it my business to know things," he cut in, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "And I have a proposition for you." Emily's eyes narrowed. "I don't need charity." "Good," he said, a faint smirk flickering across his lips. "Because I'm not offering any." He leaned forward, resting an elbow on the counter, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her want to step back. "I'll clear your debts, all £200,000 of them. The house stays yours, no strings attached, except one." Her heart pounded. "What's the catch?" James straightened, the smirk fading into a cold, calculated look. "Marry me." The words hit like a thunderclap. Emily blinked, her mind reeling to make sense of them. "What?" "You heard me," he said, unfazed. "A contract marriage. 1 year. No love, no emotions, just a transaction. In return, your family's debt disappears." She stared at him, waiting for a punchline, but his expression didn't waver. "Why me?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're James Harrington. You could have anyone." He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't quite solved. "Because my grandmother, Lady Margaret, is dying. She's the only person who matters to me, and she wants to see me settled before she goes. I need a wife to make her happy, someone who can play the part convincingly. You're desperate enough to agree, and his eyes swept over her, assessing, you have a kind face. She'll like that. Emily's throat tightened, desperate. The words stung, but it was true. She was desperate. And after a year? You walk away debt-free, he said simply. We divorce, and you never see me again. She crossed her arms, her crumpled apron pressing against her chest. And you expect me to pretend to love you? In front of your family? Not my family, he corrected. Just grandmother. The rest don't matter. Keep her smiling. That's all I ask. His tone was detached, like he was negotiating a deal rather than a marriage. The bell jingled again, but Emily paid no mind to the new customer. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess. This was insane. Marrying a stranger, a man whose reputation screamed trouble. But what was the alternative? Losing the house, the last piece of her father, the only home she'd ever known. She thought of the bank's cold letters, the sleepless nights, the weight of failure crushing her shoulders. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice trembling. James slid a card across the counter, his initials embossed in gold. You have until tomorrow. Call me when you've decided. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back. Don't wait too long, Emily. The bank won't. He was gone before she could reply, the door closing behind him, leaving only the echo of his footsteps in the folder on the counter. She opened it with shaky hands. Inside was a contract, black ink on crisp white paper, spelling out the terms he described. 1 year, £200,000, a line awaiting her signature. That night, Emily sat in her tiny flat, the contract spread out on the wobbly kitchen table. Rain roared outside the window, a fitting soundtrack to her turmoil. She called her landlord earlier, begging for a rent extension, but he laughed her off. Pay up or pack up, love. She had no one left, no family, no friends with that kind of money. Just her, the debt, and now this mad offer from James Harrington. Her finger traced the words. No love, no strings. Could she do it? Pretend to be someone's wife? Live a lie for a year, all for a man who saw her as a tool? But then she thought of Lady Margaret, a dying woman who just wanted her grandson happy. Emily knew loss. Her father's death had hollowed her out. If she could bring a bit of peace to someone, even a stranger, wasn't it worth it? By morning, her decision was made. She dialed the number on the card, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. I'll do it, she said when James answered. Good, he replied, no hint of surprise. Meet me at St. Mary's Church tomorrow, 2 p.m. Wear something white. The wedding took place quietly in the dim nave of St. Mary's Church, its ancient stone walls damp with London's perpetual mist. Emily stood in a simple white dress she'd found at a thrift shop, its lace hem frayed but elegant enough. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small bouquet of daisies, the only thing she'd allowed herself to buy. James stood beside her, impeccable in a black suit, his face expressionless. The vicar's voice droned through the vows, and Emily repeated them mechanically. I, Emily Carter, take you, James Harrington. Lady Margaret sat in the front pew, frail in a wheelchair, her silver hair pinned neatly under a velvet hat. Her eyes shimmered with tears as she watched, a smile lighting her wrinkled face. My boy, she whispered, grasping Emily's hand after the ceremony. You've made me so happy. Emily forced a smile, her chest tightening at the old woman's warmth. I'm glad, she said softly, squeezing Margaret's fragile fingers. For a moment, she forgot the contract, the debt, the cold man beside her. This was why she'd said yes, not just for the house, but for this fleeting joy in a stranger's eyes. James stood a step away, watching. His face remained impassive, but his gray eyes softened, just for a second, when Margaret pulled Emily into a weak embrace. It was a flicker, a crack in his icy facade, gone as quickly as it appeared. Emily caught it, though, and something stirred in her, a question she couldn't yet name. Lady Beatrice, James's mother, loomed at the back of the church, her fur coat dripping with wealth and disdain. She hadn't spoken during the ceremony, but her presence was a storm cloud. As they left, she intercepted Emily at the door, her voice low and venomous. "A penniless girl doesn't belong in our world," she hissed. Emily stiffened, her cheeks burning, but before she could reply, James stepped between them. "She's my wife now, Mother," he said coolly. "That's all that matters." Beatrice's lips thinned, but she said nothing more, sweeping out into the rain. Emily glanced at James, hoping for an explanation, but he only adjusted his cufflinks and walked ahead. "Let's go," he said over his shoulder. "Grandmother's waiting." They drove in silence to the Mayfair penthouse, a sleek fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city. Emily clutched her bag with the contract inside, its weight a reminder of the deal she'd struck. James didn't look at her as they stepped inside, his voice flat as he pointed down a hallway. "Your room's that way. Don't disturb me unless it's about grandmother." She nodded, her throat dry, and watched him disappear into another wing. Alone in the vast, cold space, she sank onto the edge of her new bed, the reality of her choice settling like a stone in her chest. She was Emily Harrington now, wife to a man who didn't care, bound by a contract she couldn't escape. But as she thought of Lady Margaret's smile and that fleeting softness in James's eyes, she wondered if this bargain held more than either of them knew. Welcome to Soul Stories. Life can be overwhelming, but here we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow, means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave an "I am happy" in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter together. Chapter 2. Cold Shadows and Hidden Warmth. The penthouse of James Harrington perched atop the highest floor of a glass and steel building in Mayfair, London, a place of luxury, but as cold as the man himself. When Emily Carter first stepped into the apartment on a rainy afternoon, she felt small amidst the pristine white walls, gleaming marble floors, and massive windows opening to a misty cityscape. There was no warmth of a home, no family photos, no potted plants, just sharp black and white furniture, and a heavy silence that enveloped everything. James had pointed her to a room at the end of the hallway with a curt voice. "You stay there. Don't bother me." Then he vanished through another door, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar space. Those first days passed like a hazy dream. Emily tried to adjust to her new life, but she and James lived like two parallel lines, never crossing. He went out nearly every night, the roar of his sports car's engine echoing from the Mayfair streets as he sped off to all-night parties. She caught glimpses of tabloid headlines while waiting for water to boil for tea. James Harrington spotted again with Model X in Soho. CEO of Harrington Enterprises burns cash in high-flying night. He'd return at dawn, reeking of whiskey and expensive cologne, his gray eyes weary but never meeting hers. Emily didn't ask, didn't speak. She simply stepped past him to clean up the traces he left. A jacket slung over a chair, a broken wine glass by the table. But there was one corner of the penthouse that wasn't cold. Lady Margaret's room. James's grandmother lived in a quiet nook of the apartment, a smaller space with red velvet curtains, thick rugs, and old photographs on the walls. A warm contrast to the rest of the house. Emily spent most of her time there, caring for the old woman with a devotion she hadn't expected to feel for a stranger. Lady Margaret, though frail and confined to a wheelchair, always smiled when Emily entered. "Good girl," she'd say, her raspy but warm voice accompanied by a trembling hand reaching for Emily's. Emily brought her tea, tucked blankets around her, and sat listening to stories of the Harrington family's past, tales James had never shared. James was a lonely boy, Lady Margaret said one afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against the window. She held an old photo, a dark-haired boy standing beside her, his gray eyes gazing sadly into the distance. His parents were too busy with the company, with lavish parties. Only I was there for him, teaching him chess, reading him stories. She smiled faintly, but her eyes held a trace of sorrow. He doesn't let anyone close anymore, not since he grew up. But I know deep down, he's still a child who needs love. Emily listened, her heart aching as she thought of James, the cold man she called her husband. She began to see cracks in his armor, the silence as he passed his grandmother's room, the brief pause of his gaze on a family photo before turning away. He wasn't the heartless playboy the papers painted, or at least not entirely, but he still kept her at a distance, as if she were just a piece of the contract, nothing more. One stormy night, something shifted, however slightly. Emily was sitting with Lady Margaret, draping an extra wool blanket over her as the old woman's coughing grew harsher. The clock struck midnight, and she'd grown used to James being out. But then the front door banged open, followed by stumbling footsteps. She stood, stepping into the hallway, and saw him, James Harrington, drunk, his shirt crumpled, hair disheveled and wet with rain. He leaned against the wall, his gray eyes bleary as they fixed on her. "What are you doing here?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from liquor. "Grandmother's been coughing a lot," Emily replied, calm despite her racing heart. "I stayed with her." James smirked, as if about to say something sarcastic, but then he swayed, nearly falling. Instinctively, Emily stepped forward to steady him, her hand brushing his firm arm through the wet fabric. He looked up, his hazy gaze locking onto hers, and for a moment she saw something, a deep sadness, a vulnerability he never showed. But then he pushed her hand away, mumbling, "I can manage." She said nothing, just turned to the kitchen, brewed a cup of hot tea, and set it on the table beside him, though he hadn't asked. Returning to Lady Margaret's room, she heard his footsteps pause at the threshold. James stood there, silently watching her tuck the blanket around his grandmother, the dim hallway light casting shadows on his face. He didn't speak, but that look wasn't as cold as before. It held a hint of curiosity, a softness he didn't realize he was revealing. Emily felt it, and for the first time, she wondered if he was truly the stranger she'd assumed. The next morning, he didn't mention the night before. He donned his perfect suit and left as usual, but the teacup on the table was empty, a small sign he'd drunk it. Emily smiled faintly, just for a moment, and went on with her day beside Lady Margaret. But that fragile peace didn't last. Lady Beatrice, James's mother, arrived at the penthouse one weekend afternoon, bringing a storm of contempt and power. She swept in wearing an expensive fox fur coat, her heels clicking on the stone floor, her sharp eyes scanning Emily as if she were a stain to be scrubbed away. "I hear the girl's still here," she said to James, her voice haughty, ignoring Emily's presence, though she stood right there. "A gold digger, nothing more." James sat on the sofa, flipping through a financial newspaper, not looking up. "Mother, she's my wife. Legally." "Legally?" Lady Beatrice scoffed, turning to Emily. "You think you're worthy of the Harrington name? A tea-shop girl with no money, no status? I know your kind, clinging on to climb up." Emily clenched her fists, her cheeks burning with shame. She wanted to argue, to shout that she wasn't a gold digger, that she only wanted to save her father's house. But the words stuck in her throat, and she stood there, silently enduring. Lady Beatrice didn't stop. She invited 2 other young women to the penthouse that very night, girls in dazzling evening gowns, their blonde hair gleaming, their laughter filling the apartment. "These are the ones who suit you, James," she said, shooting Emily a disdainful glance. "Not some trash from the Cotswolds." James didn't resist. He sat among the crowd, sipping whiskey, letting his mother take charge. Emily stood in the corner, holding a tray of tea she'd brought out, feeling more like a servant than a wife. When a blonde girl leaned against his shoulder, giggling, she couldn't take it anymore. She set the tray down and slipped out of the room, her footsteps heavy as she headed to her own space. She didn't cry. She told herself she wouldn't cry for a man who didn't care. But her heart ached, a cut deeper than she wanted to admit. But as she passed through the hallway, she felt James's gaze. He lifted his head from his drink, watching her go, and in those gray eyes flickered a trace of guilt, a small but unmistakable emotion. He didn't speak, didn't stand, but that look was like a silent apology. Emily paused for a second, glancing back, and for the first time, she saw him not just as a Playboy CEO or a paper husband. He was a man carrying wounds, and she, however unintentionally, was brushing against them. That night, as she lay in bed, the rain tapping steadily on the glass, she thought of James, of that look, of Lady Margaret's stories, of the tea he'd drunk. She wasn't sure what was happening, but a tiny seed had been planted, a spark of warmth hidden in the cold shadows of this marriage. And though she didn't want to admit it, she began to wonder if a year would be enough to understand the enigmatic man she called her husband. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Ice. London in late autumn carried a languid beauty, with cold winds sweeping through cobblestone streets and the Thames shimmering silver under a gray sky. Emily Carter had been living in James Harrington's penthouse for nearly 2 months, but the early days of distance now felt far off. James no longer left the house every night as he once did. The all-night parties in Soho or Mayfair grew less frequent, and she began to hear his footsteps echoing in the hallway earlier. Not at dawn, but in the late evening hours when the city was still awake. He said nothing about this change, but Emily noticed, and a part of her wondered if it had anything to do with her. Their lives were no longer entirely two parallel lines. James started appearing more often in the moments she spent with Lady Margaret, his grandmother. One afternoon, when the rain paused and the sun peeked out weakly, he unexpectedly suggested taking her for a walk along the Thames. "She likes the fresh air," he said, his voice even, as if it were a casual thought. Emily nodded, pushing Lady Margaret's wheelchair out the door while James walked beside her, hands in his coat pockets, gray eyes gazing into the distance. Along the riverbank, the wind tousled strands of Emily's hair, and she smiled as Lady Margaret pointed at a flock of ducks swimming near Westminster Bridge. "James used to love feeding them bread when he was little," she recounted, her raspy voice warm. "He'd toss a whole loaf into the water, then get cranky when I told him a few crumbs would do." She laughed, a frail sound full of affection. Emily glanced at James, expecting a denial or a quip, but he only quirked his lips in a rare fleeting smile. "I wasn't cranky," he said, his tone low. "I just thought those ducks deserved more." She laughed, a natural, unrestrained sound, and for the first time, James turned to look at her, lingering. His eyes weren't as cold as before. They brightened slightly, as if her laughter had touched a hidden corner of him. When Lady Margaret began to cough, they both bent to help her, his hand brushing hers as he steadied the wheelchair. They both hesitated, fingers grazing in a brief moment, and Emily felt a jolt run through her. She looked up, meeting his gaze, confused, but he didn't pull away. James didn't either. They stood there, hands touching, until the old woman's cough pulled them back to reality. From that day, moments of closeness began to seep into their lives. Emily often recounted to James the funny stories Lady Margaret shared during the day, like the time he tried to catch a pigeon in the garden and tumbled into the mud, or how he used to hide biscuits under his pillow for a midnight snack. At first, James just nodded, but gradually he started to respond. "How could she tell that story?" he said once, his tone teasing. "I remember catching that pigeon." Emily laughed heartily, and for the first time he joined her, a genuine, unforced laugh that lit up his usually cold face like a street lamp in a rainy night. She realized she liked seeing him like that, and the thought made her heart beat faster. That change led to a turning point one stormy night, when London was plunged into darkness and thunder rumbled. Emily was sitting in the living room, reading an old Jane Austen book Lady Margaret had lent her, when the front door swung open. James stepped in, soaked from head to toe, his shirt clinging to his body, reeking of whiskey. He staggered, bracing himself against the wall, his gray eyes bleary, yet strangely alight. Emily set the book down and stood, unsure what to do. "You're drunk again," she said, her voice soft but unable to hide her concern. James smirked, a crooked smile. "You care?" He stepped forward, nearly falling, and she quickly moved to catch him. Her hands gripped his arm, feeling the taut muscle beneath the wet fabric, and he looked up at her. They were only inches apart, his breath brushing her cheek, carrying the scent of liquor and something warm, uniquely his. "I don't need anyone to care," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. It trembled, as if he were wrestling with himself. Emily steadied him, her tone gentle. "Everyone does, James. Even you." He fell silent, his gaze locked on hers, and then he spoke, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I've never let anyone close, except grandmother, and now, maybe you." The confession was like a stone dropped into a still lake, shattering the ice between them. Emily froze, her heart pounding, but before she could reply, James leaned down, his lips meeting hers. The kiss started slowly, tentative, as if he weren't sure what he was doing. But then it ignited, fierce, desperate, like a fire held back too long. Emily responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, forgetting the contract, the distance, everything but the warmth of him under the dim light. Rain roared outside the window, but in that room, there was only the mingling of their breaths and the synchronized beating of their hearts. When they pulled apart, both breathless, James's eyes blazed with an emotion she'd never seen before, a sincerity, a longing he couldn't hide. "Emily," he whispered, his hands still cradling her face, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She smiled, though her heart trembled at what had just happened. "Then we'll figure it out together," she replied, and for the first time, she felt they were no longer two strangers bound by paper. But that budding light was soon tested. A few days after the kiss, Lady Beatrice appeared at the penthouse with a new assault. She brought a tabloid, tossing it onto the table in front of Lady Margaret and Emily as they sipped tea. The headline screamed in red ink, "James Harrington's contract wife, fraud or gold digger." The article slandered Emily, claiming she'd tricked James into marriage, that she was just an opportunist exploiting the Harrington family. Emily paled, her hands trembling as she read the vicious words. Lady Margaret frowned, looking at her daughter-in-law. "Beatrice, what is this?" "The truth, of course," Lady Beatrice replied, her voice triumphant. "I had her investigated. This girl isn't worthy of James. She's after our money. Don't you see, Mother? A tea-shop girl daring to dream of being a Harrington?" Emily felt as if she'd been slapped. She stood, intending to leave, unwilling to let the old woman see her with doubt in her eyes. But then James walked in, his face darkening as he spotted the paper on the table. He skimmed the headline, then glared at his mother, his gray eyes blazing with fury. "What are you doing?" he growled, his voice low but dangerous. "Protecting you," Lady Beatrice answered, unflinching. "This girl is a mistake, James. I just want your grandmother to see the truth." James clenched his fists, the paper crumpling in his grip. He turned to Emily, his gaze softening slightly as he saw her bowed head, her shoulders trembling. Then he faced his mother again, his voice hard as steel. "She's my wife, Mother. Deal with it." Lady Beatrice froze, her lips tightening. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but James didn't respond. He stepped to Emily's side, placing a hand on her shoulder, a small but meaningful gesture. For the first time, he publicly stood by her against his mother, and that act was like a silent pledge between them. When Lady Beatrice left, leaving a heavy atmosphere behind, Lady Margaret took Emily's hand, whispering, "Don't mind her, dear. James chose you. That's what matters." Emily nodded, her eyes blurred with tears, but she felt the warmth of James's hand still on her shoulder. He said nothing, but that touch spoke volumes, that the contract's boundaries had shattered, and between them now was something deeper. That night, as she lay in bed, the rain still falling steadily, Emily thought of the kiss, of James's gaze, of how he'd defended her. The cracks in his icy facade had widened, and she knew, though he wouldn't admit it, that she was becoming part of a world he'd once kept closed. Their feelings were no longer pretense, they were burning, and though the road ahead might be tough, she was ready to walk it with him. Chapter 4. Love Amidst Loss. Winter arrived in London with biting winds, sweeping the last leaves from the cobblestone streets and draping a thin layer of white frost over the Thames. In the Mayfair penthouse, the air seemed warmer than ever, not because of modern fireplaces or soft golden lights, but because of the love blossoming between Emily Carter and James Harrington. After the kiss under the dim glow of a rainy night, the boundaries of their contract had crumbled, giving way to a deep connection neither had anticipated. James was no longer just a husband on paper, and Emily was no longer the girl bound by debt. They had become something more, something they hadn't yet dared to name. Their feelings took root in simple yet meaningful moments. One evening, as rain tapped steadily against the windows, James stepped into Lady Margaret's room, where Emily sat reading Wuthering Heights to his grandmother. Her voice was gentle, rising and falling, filling the space with the tragic love story of Heathcliff and Catherine. Lady Margaret, though frail, smiled, her cloudy eyes sparkling as she listened to each word. James paused at the threshold, saying nothing, and quietly took a seat in the armchair beside her. When Emily finished a chapter, he spoke unexpectedly, his voice low. "You used to read this to me when I was 10. I hated the ending. Too sad." Lady Margaret chuckled softly, her trembling hand brushing his. "You always hated sad stories, James. But sometimes, sadness makes us cherish happiness more." Emily glanced at James, catching his gaze, soft, full of nostalgia. "I don't remember you saying that," he said, but the rare smile on his lips showed he was reliving the memory. From that day, he joined them often, listening to Emily read, recounting tales his grandmother had once told him. The days he hid in the garden to skip piano lessons, or the time he broke her favorite vase just to see what was inside. Emily laughed heartily, and James, though he tried to maintain his cool demeanor, couldn't hide his joy at seeing her smile. One night after Lady Margaret had fallen asleep, James pulled Emily out to the balcony where rain drizzled through the glass roof. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, his warm breath grazing her hair. "I've never told anyone about my childhood," he whispered, his voice husky. "My parents only cared about money, prestige. Grandmother was the only one there for me, teaching me how to tie my shoes, how to face my fears. I married you for her, Emily. But now, I'm here for you." The confession was like a warm breeze sweeping through her heart. Emily turned, placing a hand on his cheek, feeling the sincerity in his gray eyes. "I'm here for you, James," she replied, and they kissed, a tender, profound kiss, like a promise unspoken. Beneath London's rainy veil, they were no longer two strangers bound by a contract. They were two souls who had found each other amidst life's fragments. But that happiness didn't last. Lady Margaret's health declined rapidly by mid-January. Her coughs grew more violent, and the hands that once gripped Emily's tightly now trembled with little strength. One frigid morning, as snow began to fall lightly outside the window, she called them both to her room. Her voice was faint, but her eyes still shone with love. "James, Emily," she said, her breathing halting. "I know my time is running out, but I'm happy because I see you two together." James knelt by the bed, clutching her hand, his face pale. "Don't say that. You'll get better." Lady Margaret smiled, shaking her head. "No, my boy, I've lived enough. But promise me one thing. Love Emily. She's your heart now." She looked at Emily, her gaze gentle. "You're the greatest gift I've had besides James." Emily choked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'll take care of him, grandmother," she whispered, holding her hand tighter. Lady Margaret nodded, then closed her eyes, her breathing slowing. James gripped her hand, his voice trembling. "Grandmother." But she didn't respond. One final breath escaped, and she was gone, leaving an unfillable void in the small, warm room. James broke down instantly. He stood, staggering out of the room without a word. Emily heard his door slam shut, followed by silence, a silence heavier than the rain that once tapped the glass. She wanted to follow, but she knew he needed time. She stayed, arranging the funeral with quiet patience, though her heart, too, was shattered by the loss of the woman who had brought her and James together. 3 days after the funeral, James remained locked in his room. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't answer when Emily knocked. She stood outside, her heart aching, but she didn't give up. One night, as snow blanketed the roof, she brought a tray of tea and toast to his door. "James," she called, her voice soft but firm. "You can't keep doing this. Grandmother wouldn't want it." There was no reply, but she didn't leave. She sat on the floor, leaning against the door, and began to recount the stories Lady Margaret had shared with her. "She told me about the time you climbed a tree to get a bird's nest but fell and cried all day. She said you were stubborn, but you always had a good heart." She smiled faintly through tears. "She loved you so much, James, and she believed you'd get through this." The door suddenly swung open, and James stood there, eyes red, hair disheveled, face gaunt from lack of sleep. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of pain, and then collapsed into her arms. He sobbed, choked, wrenching cries that burst forth like a dam breaking. "I can't lose her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And I can't lose you too, Emily." She held him tightly, tears falling into his hair. "You won't lose me," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm here, James. I'll always be here." They sat there on the penthouse's cold floor, clinging to each other amidst their grief. Their love was forged in that moment, a deep love, transcending every contract, every barrier, built from tears and mutual solace. But the darkness hadn't fully lifted. Lady Beatrice, James's mother, saw an opportunity in her son's pain. A week after the funeral, she appeared at the penthouse, armed with arrogance and a malicious plan. She strode into the living room, where Emily was tidying old photos of Lady Margaret, and threw a newspaper onto the table. The headline blared, "James Harrington plans divorce after grandmother's death." "I told the press," Lady Beatrice declared, her voice icy. "This girl is a curse. Look what happened to my mother. She's not worthy of you, James. Divorce her now, before she drags the whole family down." Emily stood frozen, her hands shaking as she read the slanderous words. She looked up, about to protest, but Lady Beatrice pressed on. "I've arranged another girl, Sinclair's daughter, wealthy, prestigious, the right match for the Harrington line." James stepped in from the hallway, his face still haggard, but his gray eyes flared with anger at his mother's words. "What are you doing?" he roared, his voice low but sharp. "Protecting you," Lady Beatrice replied, unwavering. "This girl is a mistake. She brought death to my mother. Don't you see?" James clenched his fists, the paper crumpling in his grip. He turned to Emily, seeing her bowed head, tears falling silently. Then he faced his mother, his voice like steel. "Emily is the only reason I'm still standing right now. Grandmother loved her, and so do I. You want me to divorce her? Never." Lady Beatrice stood stunned, her lips tightening. "You'll regret choosing her," she hissed, but James didn't answer. He stepped to Emily's side, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly in front of his mother. "She's my wife," he said, his voice resolute. "You can't change that." When Lady Beatrice left, leaving a heavy air behind, Emily leaned into James's chest, her tears soaking his shirt. He stroked her hair, whispering, "I won't let anyone hurt you." That promise warmed her heart like a flame, and she knew, no matter how painful the loss, no matter how fierce the opposition, their love was strong enough to overcome it all. That night they lay together in bed, the rain blending with their breathing. James held her hand, whispering, "Grandmother was right. You're my heart." Emily smiled, tears streaming down, but this time from happiness. Their love, tempered by loss, was now a fire nothing could extinguish. Chapter 5. A Fragile Family. Spring arrived in London with gentle rains and faint sunshine, like a promise of new beginnings. In the Mayfair penthouse, Emily Carter stood before the bathroom mirror, her hands trembling as she held a pregnancy test. 2 red lines appeared clearly, and her heart pounded, part joy, part fear. She'd suspected it for weeks as her body began to change. Morning nausea, lingering exhaustion, and a strange but warm feeling inside. Now it was confirmed. She was pregnant, a child of hers and James Harrington's, the man who had once been a husband on paper, now the love of her life. She stepped into the living room, where James sat reading a financial newspaper, the light from the window illuminating his sharp features. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, his gray eyes flickering with curiosity. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked, his voice low but gentle, a stark shift from the cold man she'd met nearly a year ago. Emily took a deep breath and smiled, though her heart quivered. "James, I'm pregnant." He froze, the newspaper slipping from his hands to the floor. For a moment she feared a negative reaction, that this child might burden the free life he'd once cherished. But then he stood, crossed to her, and pulled her tightly into his arms, his breath brushing her hair. "Really?" he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. When she nodded, he smiled, a radiant, rare smile that lit up the room. "You and this baby. You're my whole world." The weeks that followed brimmed with hope. They painted the nursery together in the penthouse, choosing a pale blue, the color of London's sky when the rain clears, James said, his hands streaked with paint as he tried to draw a cloud on the wall. Emily laughed heartily, wiping paint from his cheek, and he pulled her into a sweet kiss amidst the scattered furniture. They dreamed of the future, a small family, the sound of a child's laughter replacing the cold silence that once dominated the space. James abandoned his partying ways entirely, spending every evening with Emily, resting his hand on her belly and whispering to the baby, "You'll be the best thing I've ever had." But that joy was soon tested. Oliver Harrington was born on a rainy August day, 3 weeks premature. When Emily awoke in the hospital room, she didn't hear her baby's cry, only the beeping of machines and the doctor's grave expression. "Your son has a congenital heart condition," he said, his voice low. "It's very serious. We're not sure he'll make it." Emily felt her world collapse. She looked at James standing by the bed, his fists clenched, his face ashen. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "That's not possible." He stormed out, and Emily heard him shouting at the doctor in the hallway, a cry of anguish and helplessness. Oliver was taken to intensive care, a tiny boy lying in an incubator, surrounded by a tangle of wires and tubes around his fragile body. Emily and James took turns keeping vigil beside him, their eyes never leaving their son. Those first days were a nightmare. Each beep from the machines stabbed their hearts like a knife. James, once invincible in her eyes, was now broken. One night, when the doctor said Oliver might not survive the week, he held her and wept, his tears soaking her shoulder. "I can't lose him," he whispered, his voice shattered. "I can't lose anyone else, Emily." She hugged him tightly, though she trembled too. "We'll fight," she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down. Together. They embarked together on a battle to save Oliver's life. Emily became James's strength, though she was exhausted herself. Each night, she sat by the incubator, singing to the baby despite her voice quaking with fatigue and fear. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word," she sang, her hand pressed to the glass as if to touch him. James watched her, his gray eyes full of admiration and love, and he knew she was why he didn't fall apart. James abandoned all revelry, every unnecessary meeting, to be with his family. He sat for hours beside Oliver, telling him stories he'd heard from his grandmother, about days running through the Cotswolds garden, how she taught him to tie his shoes. "You have to be strong like grandmother," he whispered, his voice choked. "I need you." The climax came on a stormy night, when London was cloaked in pitch black, thunder growling as if to tear the sky apart. In the intensive care unit, Oliver suddenly stopped breathing. The machine's alarm shrieked like a heart-wrenching scream, slicing through the hospital's stillness, and James and Emily's hearts seemed to stop with it. Nurses rushed in, white-clad figures darting like ghosts in a nightmare. But James just stood there, his gray eyes wide, empty, as if his soul had been sucked away with his son's breath. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms until they bled. But he didn't feel the pain. Physical hurt was nothing compared to the wave of despair drowning him. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking in a futile plea. "Not this. It can't be." He remembered his grandmother, Lady Margaret, who'd left him on a cold winter day, and now that same darkness returned, frigid and merciless, threatening to take Oliver, the last light in his life. Emily stood beside him, her body shaking like a leaf in a storm, tears streaming down her cheeks but left unwiped. They were part of her, like blood from a broken heart. She clung to James, her hands gripping his shirt, as if letting go would collapse her entire world. "Please, no," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Don't take my baby. I beg you." She didn't know who she was pleading with, God, fate, or the nurses fighting inside the glass. But the plea erupted from her depths, from a mother losing everything. She recalled the nights cradling her pregnant belly, singing to the unborn Oliver, and now she wanted to scream to pull him back from the abyss. They stood there holding each other in the cold hallway, tears mingling, despair flooding them like a torrent washing away every hope they'd held. But then, amid the chaos of machines and the howling rain, A tiny sound emerged. Oliver's faint cry, fragile as a thread, but enough to dispel the darkness. James snapped his head up, his red-rimmed eyes flashing with a spark, like a flame rekindled from ashes. He rushed to the glass, pounding on it, his voice hoarse. "My son! My son's alive!" Emily crumpled to the floor, hands covering her face, sobbing uncontrollably. But this time from joy, from a miracle she hadn't dared dream of. The nurses emerged, sweat rolling down their foreheads, and the doctor gave a weary smile. "He's stable. For now. We'll operate soon." James turned back, lifting Emily up, holding her so tightly she felt his frantic heartbeat merge with hers. He cried, tears of a father who'd walked through hell and found light. "We did it," he whispered, his voice choked, stroking her hair. "He's alive, Emily. He's alive." She leaned into his chest, tears soaking his shirt, but a smile broke through, a fragile yet radiant smile, like the first sunlight after a storm. They stood there embracing in the hospital hallway, rain still falling outside, but in their hearts, hope had returned, a small flame burning bright from Oliver's fragile life. Their love deepened with every second they fought for Oliver's survival. Each day that passed bound them closer, no longer two people tied by a contract, but a true family, linked by tears, hope, and an unshakable love. James often held her at night, whispering, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And Emily replied, "We're one, James. Always." But the trials didn't end there. Lady Beatrice, James's mother, saw an opportunity in their family's fragility. One afternoon, as Oliver was moved from intensive care to a regular room, she appeared at the hospital, armed with arrogance and a fresh attack. She stood before Oliver's bed, her cold eyes sweeping over the tiny boy lying there, then turned to Emily with a sneer. "A pitiful, sickly child," she said, her voice venomous. "A frail disgrace. Can't you even bear a proper heir for the Harringtons, Emily? You're a failure, an unworthy one." Emily clenched her fists, tears welling up, but she didn't respond. She didn't want Oliver to hear those cruel words, didn't want her son to feel his grandmother's contempt. But James, standing beside her, couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, facing his mother, his face ablaze with fury. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. "Emily has given me more than you ever did. She's the mother of my son, the one who kept me standing when I lost everything. And you, all you do is destroy." Lady Beatrice recoiled, stunned, stepping back. "You dare!" "Yes, I dare," James cut in, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Oliver is my son, and I'm proud of him, of his strength, of how he fights to live. And Emily, she's my wife, my strength. If you can't accept that, you have no place in my life." A heavy silence fell. Lady Beatrice pursed her lips, her eyes burning, but she said no more. She turned on her heel and left, leaving a tense stillness behind. Emily looked at James, tears rolling down her cheeks, but this time from emotion. He turned to her, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly in front of Oliver. "I'll protect you and him," he whispered, his voice steadfast. "No one can tear us apart." Oliver, though weak, seemed to sense his parents' love. He stirred, his small eyes opening, gazing at them with a faint but hopeful light. Emily bent down, kissing his forehead, and James placed a hand on her shoulder, the three of them forming a small circle, a fragile family, unbreakable. In the months that followed, Oliver slowly recovered after a successful heart surgery. He remained frail, but each day he grew stronger, a testament to his parents' love. Emily and James were no longer the strangers of their early days. They'd fought through long nights together, cried, laughed, prayed, and their love was now an unquenchable fire, a shield against any attack from Lady Beatrice or anyone else. One evening, as rain fell outside the hospital window, James held Emily on a couch, watching Oliver sleep peacefully in his crib. "You're everything to me," he said, his voice warm and low. "And Oliver is our miracle." Emily leaned into his chest, smiling through tears. "We're a family, James. No matter what, we'll always be together." Their love, tested by pain and hope, was now an unbreakable bond. Though Oliver was still fragile, though Lady Beatrice still lurked, they knew, As long as they had each other, they could overcome anything. Chapter 6. True Love, Triumphant. Summer in the Cotswolds brought gentle sunny days and endless green fields, a reminder that after cold winter days, light always returns. 5 years had passed since those dark times in the hospital, when Emily Carter and James Harrington held each other, praying for the fragile life of their son, Oliver. Now, in the small stone cottage they'd bought in this countryside, the house once owned by Emily's father and saved by their contract marriage, laughter and music had replaced the cold silence that once dominated their lives. Oliver Harrington, now 5 years old, was no longer the frail boy lying in an incubator, surrounded by wires and tubes. The heart surgery 4 years ago had given him a chance at life, and his parents' unwavering love had carried him through the tough days that followed. Though still smaller than his peers, Oliver had James's gray eyes and Emily's gentle smile, a perfect blend of the two who had fought to keep him in this world. But what made him special wasn't just his resilience. It was his innate musical talent, an unexpected gift that illuminated their little family's life. It all began one rainy afternoon when Emily brought her father's old piano from the storage shed into the living room. Oliver, then just 3, climbed onto the bench and placed his tiny fingers on the keys. The first notes rang out, halting, clumsy, but then he played a simple melody, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, with an emotion that stole Emily's breath. She called James from his small home office, and he rushed in, standing silently at the door as he listened to his son play. When the tune ended, Oliver looked up, beaming. "Do you like it, Mommy and Daddy?" James knelt down, enveloping the boy in a hug, tears rolling down his cheeks, tears of joy and pride. "I like it," he whispered, his voice choked. "You're Daddy's genius." Emily stood beside them, hand over her mouth, crying from happiness. She recalled the long nights in the hospital when they feared losing him, and now Oliver wasn't just alive. He was shining, a small flame kindled from the ashes of their pain. Oliver's talent grew quickly. By 5, he was playing complex pieces by Mozart and Beethoven, his little fingers gliding over the keys with an emotion far beyond his years. James and Emily decided to hold a small concert for him at the village hall in the Cotswolds, a modest stone building with worn wooden benches and light streaming through tall windows. It was a summer evening, the sunset painting the wheat fields outside golden. Villagers gathered, curious about the boy they'd heard of, the fragile child who'd become the pride of the Harrington family. When Oliver stepped onto the stage, tiny in the black suit James had tailored for him, the audience fell silent. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the air, soft yet profound, like moonlight spilling over the Thames on the rainy nights James and Emily had weathered together. Emily sat in the front row, clutching James's hand, tears falling quietly as she listened to each note, every sound a reminder of the days they fought to keep him alive. James bowed his head, shoulders trembling slightly, and when the piece ended, he looked up, his gray eyes glistening with tears. He stood clapping first, and the room erupted in applause. After the performance, James pulled Emily to a corner of the stage, holding her tightly amid the laughter and congratulations from the crowd. "We did it," he whispered, his voice low and warm, stroking her hair. "Together, Emily." She leaned into his chest, smiling through tears. "Together," she replied, and in that moment she knew. Their love, once a cold contract, was now an unquenchable flame, burning brightly through every pain and trial. But their journey wasn't just a story of love between two people. It was also one of reconciliation with the past. Lady Beatrice, James's mother, who had once been a shadow over their marriage, appeared unexpectedly at the concert. She stood at the back of the hall, clad in an expensive fur coat, her cold eyes scanning the crowd. Emily tensed when she saw her. Lady Beatrice's harsh words still echoed in her mind. A gold digger. A pitiful, sickly child. But this time she said nothing as Oliver stepped off the stage, running to hug his parents. James looked at his mother, his face hardening, but he didn't turn away. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but wary. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her high heels clicking on the wooden floor. She looked at Oliver, the small but radiant boy, his hand still carrying the faint scent of piano resin. And then at Emily. "I heard about the concert," she said, her tone even. "I wanted to see it for myself." "And?" James asked, his hand tightening on Emily's shoulder as if ready to shield her. She was silent for a moment, her gaze flickering over Oliver before settling on Emily. "I was wrong," she said at last, her voice low but clear. "About you, Emily. I was wrong to think you weren't worthy of James, of the Harrington name." She turned to James, her eyes softening slightly. "And I was wrong not to trust my son." Emily stood stunned, hardly believing her ears. James frowned but didn't interrupt. Lady Beatrice continued, "This boy, Oliver, he's not a disgrace. He's a genius. And I see your love. It's more real than anything I ever imagined." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry." The heavy air dissolved, replaced by a stunned silence. Emily looked at James, then stepped forward, her voice trembling but sincere. "Thank you. That means a lot to us." Lady Beatrice nodded, not smiling, but her eyes no longer held their former coldness. She turned and left the hall, but this time there was no contempt or threat, only a reluctant acceptance, a first step toward reconciliation. James hugged Emily, whispering, "I didn't expect her to say that." She smiled, leaning into him. "Maybe she has a heart after all. She just hid it too well." They watched Oliver scamper around with the village children, and for the first time, they felt their family was truly whole, not just with each other, but with the past that had once divided them. Life in the Cotswolds became a simple yet fulfilling dream. James scaled back his work at the company, leaving behind Mayfair's extravagance, and built a small music school for Oliver in the village, a wooden building with a red roof where the boy could teach other children to play piano. Emily became a teacher for the local kids, teaching them to read, write, and sharing the stories she'd once told Oliver during those endless hospital nights. They were no longer a couple bound by a contract, no longer victims of opposition or pain. They were a family, a fresh start forged from the shards of their past. One lightly rainy afternoon, James and Emily stood on the porch, watching Oliver romp in the garden, chasing a yellow butterfly with peals of laughter. James took her hand, pulling her close, his breath warm against her hair. "I never thought I deserved this," he whispered, his voice low. "You and Oliver. You're everything to me." Emily smiled, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth through his sweater. "We deserve it, James. After everything, we found each other." The rain fell softly around them, but it wasn't the cold drizzle of their early London days. It was gentle, a reminder of the journey they'd traveled. They thought of Lady Margaret, the woman who'd linked them with a cold contract, but also left a will that guided them to this love. "Love Emily," she'd said, and James had done so, beyond anything she could have imagined. Beneath the misty Cotswolds sky, they held each other, knowing their true love, forged through loss, opposition, and the days they fought for Oliver's life, was their greatest strength. James whispered, "We've overcome everything." Emily nodded, tears rolling down but her smile radiant. "And we'll be together forever." Oliver ran up, tugging their hands, his young voice ringing out, "Play piano with me." They laughed, stepping inside together, the sound of the piano rising amid the rain, a melody of happiness, of eternal love, and of a family nothing could break. The story of Emily and James stands as proof that love isn't just fleeting emotion, but an enduring strength, tempered by adversity. From a cold contract, they found each other through sincerity, overcame loss with comfort, faced opposition with protection, and built a family through sacrifice. No matter how harsh life may be, true love and companionship will always be the light that guides, turning scars into stars in the sky of happiness. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.